Today we are discussing about like understanding conflict. Hope that many of you have access to book of the peace and conflict in Southeast Asia that contains so many contents that Professor Sam and Professor Yukiko have been helping written these books with the team. Several contents today. First is about like an introduction and talking about objectives of this course. And then we discuss about the nature of the conflict. We talk about like the conflict theories and the framework. And finally, we end the session by understanding a bit of the violence and non-violence conflict. These objectives to understand the principle and the concept in conflict study, to understand the definitions of peace, conflict, and the violence, and we try to understand the conditions of the conflict. When we talk about the nature of conflict, we can see that there are certain characteristics of the conflict. People in our society tend to fear that, we don't want to have conflict in our life. We don't want to have the conflict in our everyday life. We have to ask ourselves, like, who never experienced conflict in our life? I think we all have conflict in our life. When everyone experiences conflict in his or her life, which means that, is that a part of our nature? We are conflicted to each other by nature, or it is something unavoidable that we need to have conflict. When we look into the conflict, people always think that it is quite negative perspective towards conflict. But the thing is, like, we might have to ask ourselves whether are there any positive aspects or perspective towards the conflict. When we talk about the positive perspective of the conflict, maybe we have to understand the meaning of like the conflict transformation. I'm sure that everyone understands the word transformation, but the thing is like to compare the conflict with like electrical transformer. What do they what this kind of transformer transform? Do they change? What they change? This transformer that's stationed everywhere on the street. What do they do? What is the work of the transformer? They transform the high voltage electric, right, into the lower magnitude of voltage into our household. If you want to charge your mobile phone, charge the battery of your mobile phone, you might not be able to plug it in on the high voltage cable, right? So you have to make it pass through the transformer. So then it means that the high voltage is very dangerous, and not very useful. But when this high voltage electric, pass through the transformer, electrical transformer, so then they change the magnitude, they change the voltage into the usable things in our house, in our household. And then of course, like they still have some danger, electric shortage or whatever, but it is controllable. If you look into that perspective, so then in the comparison with the conflict, it is the same with this electric. So when the magnitude of the conflict tend to lead to the violence situation, so then you can transform it, into the certain things. I mean, the conflict might not be disappearing, but it is useful, but it still has some danger that you can control. When it trends to have the violence, so it's dangerous. But when you transform it, so then you can get benefit from the conflict. What is the benefit from the conflict? When you see that when there are a lot of ideas, that belong to several groups or several stakeholders, and then once it has, it makes certain conflict situation, and then once they can settle those conflicts, at least they might come up with some better idea, or the idea that can be accepted by several groups, and that can make the society move forward. Or even in several other ideas, you must have many new ideas. You have to have conflict with the old ideas. So that's why you produce the new ideas. The innovation and many things came from what we have the conflict with the previous ideas or previous notions. So then this is the positive perspective of the conflict. The next thing is about the dispute and the dilemma. When we talk about like the conflict, mostly we always think that it happens only with people, I mean, more than two people, up from two people. But the thing is, like in certain conditions, like the dilemma is also quite important. So then when we study about the conflict, which is the dispute between two or more people, maybe we still have to take into account that an individual also can struggle with the conflict with oneself. What is important with the conflict with oneself and how the conflict with oneself is related to the dispute of the two or more people. The dilemma is something that you might have two or more options of things that you make to make the decision. But once you make the decision of one of these two things, the other things cannot be taken at the same time, which means that you have to think about, to choose what to do or what not to do. The thing is that, for example, I'm from a country where the coup d'etat is a kind of ritual in the mind of those people who have power and who have capability to stage a coup d'etat. They always have this dilemma that whether they should do and they should not do. But the thing is, like, if we can link whether if they do it, they might have consequences that their decision makes into the dispute, which means a conflict between more than one person. So then this is the relation between the influence of the dilemma that might lead into the dispute. The conflict within oneself might be able to lead into the conflict in the society. This kind of conflict is about the dispute, which requires more than one person, okay? Which means a pursuit of incompatible goals by the different groups, which means that there are certain particular things that people need, and it is considered to be the incompatible goals. For example, in the deep south of Thailand, the minority from the whole country of Thailand is the Malay ethnic, with the Muslim that have the and they are the Muslim. But they are the majority in the three southernmost provinces of Thailand. And at least in the past 1.5 decades, almost 2 decades, the violence conflict ignited and still continue until current stage. And the condition that the insurgent groups, I have to use this word first because it's very understand, the separatist group demand is to separate, is to be independent from Thailand. That is the standpoint, which means this is the goal and the standpoint of the separatist, which means that they want to separate. But for the state of Thailand, it has been addressed on the first article in Thai constitution, saying that Thailand is unitary state, which is unseparable, which means unseparable. So then these cannot be together at the same time. To be independent, which means you have to separate that area out of the of Thailand. But to be unitary state, which means one in one condition cannot be separated. So these two goals are incompatible, which means that it is considered into, like this kind of thing, to pursue a compatible goals, so then these two standpoints and goals are not compatible. Another characteristic of of the conflict, we might be focusing into five categories. One is about the information. Certain conflict regarding information means that there are sources, different sources of information that give a different point of view. You can see easily, in United States, when you during the time of election, if you following Fox News, Republican always has the lead, and if you follow CNN, so then Democrats always have the certain lead, because at least they try to convince certain groups of people. So then there are misinformation in certain point, or different sources of information, or different set of information, or lack of knowledge, or maybe different interpretation of the knowledge. So then those are the conditions that might lead into conflict regarding the information. Or the combination of the interest conflict that might include the benefits of people, something that beneficial, something that can be accounted for, some kind of assets, rights, or certain conditions that involve the interest of the people, that leads into certain conflict. Okay. Another thing is the relationship conflict. So then this derives the condition of linkages of people, to have certain relations, or some kind of groups, identity groups that they belong to. For example, when in Thailand right now, when you see that there are certain groups, it might be a little bit belong to right-wing royalists, also a little bit fight against the more liberal group, a little bit called left-wing, more liberal group. So then even this, even we don't have personal contact, but the thing is we are capable to fight or to hate or to polarize these groups by having certain affiliations among the same group, and of course cutting linkages between the other affiliations. So then this is the conditions that leads to the category of the relationship conflict. Okay. The third one is about the structural conflict, which involves the rule of law in the country, rules, laws, regulations, economic status, economic system, justice system, whatever frame that make the social structure. So then that's also the sources of conflict. For example, when we are living in a country where there's a kind of lack of rule of law, or there's no justice in the country, or maybe we have to deal with a lot of injustice, abuse of power. So then this is the condition that leads to structural conflict. The last thing, and is quite very important, is that something about the value conflict, which is actually involve almost every part of our lives, because for example, to have certain identity, to have certain value together with that identity. For example, when I claim myself to be a Malay Muslim, so then it's not just being identify myself as a Malay, or as a Malay ethnic or Muslim religion, but it is contains certain value together with it. What is the value of being a Muslim? Or what is the value of being a Malay? What's the value of being a Thai? So this kind of thing is the value. And when there are certain values that has been oppressed, that has been neglected, so then those are the conditions that can lead to the value conflict. Or sometimes with in certain community where some kind of religious ritual cannot be practiced, or like some kind of belief that cannot be practiced or carry on. So then those conditions are also leading to the value conflict. So these are the points when we talk about the nature of conflict. When we talk about the nature of conflict, relates to the cognition, the people cognition to the conflict. As like we mentioned earlier, or I mentioned earlier just right now, that many people consider that when we look into the conflict with the negative attitude, okay, some people think about the conflict as a positive attitude. Some just like, okay, maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. And I think this is quite a common thing, we are going very quickly from this. When you see the conflict with the negative attitude, you see that the conflict is dangerous, it's very risky, it has a lot of argument, you have to fight, and the conflict might leads to war or like some kind of violence. So then this is like how we look into the conflict in a negative view. But for those who think about the conflict as a positive attitude, you might see that the conflict is an opportunity to do what? To improve, opportunity to move forward, opportunity to make some mutual understanding, this kind of thing. Or the conflict might be eased or might be de-escalated by non-violence means, so then it might be, overcome the conflict by the non-violence mechanism. When we have the conflict, we might have chances to make a lot of new things, which means that we need to have creativity, some kind of creativity that you might require, because like if, we don't have that conflict, everyone thinks the same, everyone is the same, abide to the same rules, this kind of thing, you don't have any creativity. But of course, like when there are several different ideas, some kind of conflict occurs, so then it might lead to some creativity. This creativity means that you might try to create space for the coexistence. Okay, the conflict might be the motor of change. So then, like, if you want to improve, if you want to change the society, if you want to change things, so then you might require the conflict, because like if you feel comfortable with the place where you are when you are doing where you are living, the things that you are doing, the position that you are standing on. So if you feel that kind of comfortable in these kind of things, so then you might not have to change. But if you have the conflict, maybe it is kind of like a motor to change, to from thing to another thing. Not guarantee that it's going to be a better one, but it's kind of the change. Positive attitude might lead you into some innovation, something new, something more creative. Like when you look into our, our mobile phone, like, and the camera into it and things that, you can get back into like the first, like great grandfathers, grandparents of these, electronic devices, like abacus, if we feel so comfortable with the abacus, we don't have any more innovation. So then the conflict that, okay, abacus is good, but we might need something else. So then this is a kind of conflict that make more innovation. It could be scientific innovation, and it could be social innovation as well. And for those who might think that, okay, maybe it's bad, sometimes it's good, they look into the conflict that there are certain sets of differences, there are certain sets of the differences, of course, like we have to deal with the differences. And we have to deal with the diversity among different identities of people in the society. They talk about like the needs and wants of the stakeholders when we have more than two stakeholders to take into account. And at certain point, they look into the competitive between ideas, between bonds, between goals, between objectives of different groups. So these are like people cognition to the conflict. And then of course like it is a kind of like naturally that we mostly think like this. If you consider yourself, you think back, like, oh, okay, sometimes I think that this is quite danger, sometimes it is the opportunity, we see the differences. I mean, this kind of thing come to your mind when you experience or when you are facing a conflict situation, or when you consider something could be considered as a conflict situation. So then this kind of thing that come to your mind throughout our learning process, in our lifetime. When we see that conflict is negative, so then it might lead you to make the avoidance from the conflict. Why you avoid a conflict? Because you fear of different opinions. Maybe you fear that when you face with the conflict, you have the depressed emotional feelings. And then sometimes when you fear of the conflict, okay, so then you just keep yourself up and just, okay, give the priority to the other's interest over his or her own, so then this is when you draw back, when you try to get away, try to hide away from the conflict, okay? I'm not saying that what is good or what's bad, but it is just try to explain our attitudes and our cognition, and also certain behaviors that we might act during the time or when we are facing the conflict, okay? And another conflict avoidance is about like, you think that the conflict drains energy, like it spends so much of your energy in dealing with the conflict. So then not to drain your energy, so then it's better to stay away out of the conflict. Or maybe you open conflict brings unnecessary destruction, like people who tend to think that conflict is negative might also believe that conflict brings some destruction, okay? Also, conflict only deepens opposites. Differences are basically insoluble, which means that people who tend to avoid a conflict believes that conflict will escalate into the polarization and making the differences into something more painful, more unsolvable. These differences might lead into, like a worsen of the situation that leads into the conflict. For those who think that conflict is positive, it could be capable, okay? It is like when you look into the conflict as a capability, it is capable to engage into the conflict with a creativity, secure rights to all the stakeholders. We believe that we are facing the conflict. When we are engaged in the conflict, we can create so many things, and we can, secure that everyone who is the stakeholders of the conflict, who are the stakeholders of the conflict, might have equal rights in, in solving the situation or in finding the resolution to that conflict. When you have such an energy, so then you can channel those energy into the positive ways, okay? So conflict helps us to get away from outdated patterns. When we disagree with some ideas, when we disagree with a certain value of the society, certain structure of the society, so then we might use the opportunity from having the conflict or to get a way to get out from something and to make another change. And you might see the differences vitally necessary. Working out differences benefits everyone. When you see that it is the conflict is a capability, so then this kind of energy can help you to work out differences. And then when you work out these differences, so then it can be benefited to all the stakeholders. Okay. So then we look into another extreme, which is the belligerence group. This group, when they see the conflict, they think that there might be a certain ways to solve the conflict by using forces, you know. So this group, we see that when you have the conflict, you are capable to use violence, forces, harmful to the others, you know. Sometimes we have to be considered our self-centered, give priority to one's interest more than the other. So then this kind of perspective leads us to think that we can win. You know, we can win by force. We can win by our own means. Okay. And then at a certain point, like conflict allows people who think on this to experience of their own being, and then to be self-centered, it is also quite bringing more energy to them. And of course, like some people think that to have the chaos will give rise to the new. So we change, not by the peaceful way, but maybe you need the chaotic situation in order to change. Okay. And then this group might be seeing that consensus is often an illusion because war is the father of all things, which means that to search for the democratic means by finding the consensus might not be the solution. So then this group tend to make the win by force. So these are the people cognition attitude toward the conflict. You know, just elaborate and more amplify from the previous part. When we take into account like people perceptions on the conflict is vary. I always play this game to the kids. Your left, it is the bucket number one is a very hot water. The second bucket is the room temperature water. And the third one is the icy cold water. I divide the group of the students into two groups. I ask this first group to put their hands into the bucket number one. After sometimes I ask them to put into the second bucket, which is like this the room temperature water. And I ask them, how is the temperature of the second bucket? It is hot or cold? All of the students in this group say that the water in the second bucket is cold. Okay, so we keep this group away, and I let the students from another group put their hands into the third bucket first, which is the icy cold water, and then after that I ask them to put their hands into the second bucket and ask them what is the temperature of the second bucket, whether it's hot or cold. And of course, like these kids said that the second bucket is warm. So then I bring the two groups together and then ask them all together that what is the temperature of the water in the second bucket. And of course, like group one will say that is cold, group two we say it's warm. To create a conflict is our job as well. So then we let the kids into a group started to argue why they think that the second bucket is cold, why they think that the second bucket is warm. And of course, like many of them argue that because they have really experienced by their own hands, which means that the first group, when they said that the second bucket is cold, because they really believe in their perceptions. And the second group as well believe in their perception because they touch the water in the second bucket by their own hands as well. When we review the fact that, of course, there's only one bucket of the second bucket, which of course sometimes cold, sometimes hot because of the past experience that they have experienced in the past. So then it depends when we talk about these attitudes, the cognition, seeing the conflict as a danger, risk, seeing the conflict as an opportunity, trying to avoid the conflict, or seeing the opportunity of the conflict, or trying to use the forces in order to overcome the conflict. All of this kind of thing comes from the perception of each one. And of course, when we are facing the conflict situation, it depends on how we make the interpretation of the situation based on the experience that we have. So then there might be some questions whether our cognition is accurate enough in order to make some kind of very clear-cut decision in a particular conflict situation. So then from this example, you see that even if we have perceived certain sets of information, certain sets of experience by our own sense, our own perception, our own interpretation, our own knowledge by ourselves, the first-hand experience, we might at certain points sometimes make the false interpretation of the set of the information that we have. There are a possibility that our perception is misinterpreted. This is the relationship between people perceptions of the conflict. Next is about like the theory that is quite important, and everyone who engaged in the studying conflict might be cannot be neglected. It is the conflict triangle. You can see here there are 3 points of this like triangle of A, B, C. But may I explain B first? When we talk about like conflict, there the component with like attitudes, behavior, and contradiction. The thing is like when we have certain behavior, this behavior, where it comes from, you know, certain structure, you know, which is like C, the contradiction, which is frame the conflict. And of course, like lying beneath of all of our behaviors is the attitude. We learn things, we pass through certain experiences. People who experience different things will react or we behave differently. So then behavior comes from shaping of the attitude and certain structure of the society. But at the same time, certain structure of the society and some behavior also shape up our attitude. So these A, B, C are very much interconnected and interrelated, which means that some behavior, some repeatedly behavior that we learn from maybe from our parents, from people in our society, also it makes us perceive something and build up certain attitudes. And of course, certain attitudes lead us to do some behavior or make us to build our society into certain structure. Okay, let me put this thing in a very basic way. In several countries, there are a group of migrants. There are words that we use for the migrants in Thailand. The first word is directly translated into alien. Another word that has a certain meaning of the foreigner, which is a little bit more polite in kind of in term of perception. But actually, it has the same meaning. I mean, the mutual meaning is the same, which is the people from the other places. But when you call certain group of people like alien, it is exactly make the value and interpretation into lower class group of people. But when you refer this group of the people into foreigners, so then you feel that it is more superior. So then the same thing. This is the word we call, people from the attitude that we learn from newspapers, from parents talking, from people talking. Our mind make the interpretation that those migrants are considered aliens, but those who are the business people, the tourists are considered foreigners. So this is a kind of making ideas or thinking as an attitude inside our mind from years of collecting knowledge, passing through the cognitive process, passing through a lot of learning of values of things, and then it react from that thing, from that attitude. It comes into certain contradiction, which means we are not going to be very kind by having freedom or making very equal rights to those groups that we look down, right? So then we don't have to draft a law that make migrants or cross-border laborers to get the same rights as equal as the citizen of our own country. And at the same time, when you don't have such the law or rules that make people feel equal, at sometimes you are physically abused or you abused those people. You abused by not giving them enough pay or equal into the or according to the law, or sometimes you physically abuse them because you think that they are not capable to react with any legal actions to you or whatever. So then it's become the behavior. So then this triangle of the attitudes, behavior, and the contradictions are interrelated. And of course, they interact, they have that certain interaction. Some behavior leads into the attitude, some attitudes leads into the behavior. And it's passed through the generations, which means that it can be learned. For example, if you act badly to migrant workers or the cross-border workers in your family, the children that have been experienced your behavior will shape their attitude, certain set of attitude according to the behavior that they have been experienced. So then this is going to be circle and circle between the attitude itself, between the behavior and the contradiction. So if you see in this diagram, you can see that there are three things that we talk about. We talk about the violence, we talk about the conflict, and we talk about the peace mechanism. So then if we talk about violence, so then behavior is a direct violence, okay? When contradiction mainly based on the structural violence, and of course when we talk about the attitude, it's about the cultural violence. And then when we talk about the conflict, when we have certain sets of the conflict that based on the behavior, so then we have a mechanism of conflict resolution or conflict containment to deal with this behavior behavior part. And then when we have the structural part of the contradiction, we can make the conflict settlement or conflict management. And of course, when it has to deal with the attitude, you might have to go with the conflict transformation. When we talk about the conflict, it is needed, of course, at least to address certain things about the violence. because very often that people messed up between conflict and violence, right? Just like right now, from the attitude and the cognition that we talk about, many people think that conflict might end violently. So then it is not necessary that the conflict will end violently. And of course, the conflict and violence are different. So then we might have certain kinds of conflict. And of course, we also have what we call non-violent conflict as well. So we have violence conflict and we have non-violence conflict. So to understand this, so we have to understand the violence. The violence is a psychological explanation, of violence. So then there are people, this is already scientific proof that at certain human being condition, conflict is a part of psychological damage. There are a certain group of people who are psychological damage and have violence behavior. For those serial killers and all these kind of things, it is because of the drive that they have internally, psychologically, internally. But most of the people is not, okay? Which means that it brings us to the discussions whether the conflict is the nature or the nurture of the violence behavior. Most of the people are still capable to live a life without being a violence by nature, which means that the nurturing, the environment, the cognitions, the cognitive process bring us into either violence nor non-violence or non-violence, because then it depends on the environment that brings us up, not basically because of the nature. And then we study the violence from subjective violence, objective and systemic violence, accordance with direct structural and cultural violence. When we talk about subjective violence, which means we can make the comparisons into we call it those who are organized the violence accordingly to merely physically, that you can touch, you can harm into one's life, okay? And then when we, which is the explained into the dimensions of the direct violence as well. And of course, when we talk about the systematic of social structure, for example, like the laws that are not very, according to the rule of law, abuse of power, and this kind of, it's a kind of system of the society, the structure of the country, of the society, and it is a structural violence, which means that the violence that cannot be seen very directly from the physical appearance is not about like life and death, that you can kill somebody on the street, but because the structure of the society that makes people get into the poverty, lack of the, accessible to clean water, lack of people participation, human rights abuse, these are all the systemic violence or the structural violence. But the thing is when you see another thing that comes up later on, which is the cultural violence, is directly deal with the attitude and the cognitive process of people throughout so many things. Like when you talk about you talk about the history, you have the history of, people abuses, people abused our group, our group being exploited by the other groups, or this, the storytellings, arts, music, even the language, sometimes in our the words that we use also oppress people, also abuse people by verbally. All of this kind of thing is just like making the attitudes of the people. This is called the cultural violence that make people get the hatred, hostility, or like anger, this kind of thing, which is actually not, you cannot be seen, by or cannot touch by your senses, but it passed through certain things that you learn every day, you experience every day, and it's becoming certain norms and certain value. Okay, so then next is about violence as a condition to positive and the negative peace. Because like when we talk about peace in the past, like the peace studies that has come in the past, uh, begin from peace study began from the war study. So then in the very, very beginning, uh, peace is considered something that absent of war and violence. So then by that time, that kind of situation, we could call it negative peace. And later on, when the concept of positive peace is occurred, which means that apart from not having violence, not having war, uh, social structure must be improved. The attitude of the people, should not create the hostility and the hatred among people. So then that might be called positive peace. So then violence is also the condition to distinct between the positive and the negative peace, if it deals with the direct violence. We have both like violence and non-violence conflict, which is like a kind of like difference. When we see that the conflict is an opportunity, the conflict could be opportunity only when it's not violence, when it doesn't turn violence, or even if when it turns violence, it has to be de-escalated into the non-violent situation in order to get out of certain conditions that leads to the violence, and try to resolve the conflict, try to transform the conflict and make the opportunity out of the conflict. So the term non-violence, there are two things. The thing is like the conflict that could be ended without having violence, we also call non-violence conflict. But sometimes when we have a conflict in a kind of, struggling, for example, like in Thailand, we are fighting against dictator over several times, again and again and again. We have dictators almost every 10 years, So then we have to fight with the dictators all the time. So once we have such a conflict, we also have to fight with, with the dictator or with whoever that's, oppress you. And then we can use the non-violence ways in order to fight with them, in order to, to balance the power. So the term of the non-violence came from actually the civil disobedience, during the time of the liberal war in the United States, like when people started to fight back with the Great Britain, they throw away the tea bags, from the ship in order to protest against the power of the imperial British colony. Okay, that was the beginning of the use of the term of nonviolence by the use of the term civil disobedience. And then the concept of this is considered to try to understand the consent theory of power that make the relationship between the ruler and the ruled and the subject, which means that when we have the different asymmetric power relation, so then it is very difficult to fight. So then non-violence means of fighting will try to make some kind of balance between this relationship, that are very asymmetric. Okay, so then we use non-violent methods, strategies, and goals in order to achieve, some kind of this, power struggling. And in certain situations where the conflict have not yet escalated into violence, so that's what I already explained, that sometimes when the conflict is not into the violent situation, we also use the term non-violence conflict. Okay. So you can see that it begins on the left-hand side as a differences. So the difference, people are different, and of course, like the conflict may escalate from the point where people are different, and these differences can lead into the contradiction, polarization. Like, of course, like in Thailand, you can see it very clearly that there are two groups of people, two polar. One is a little bit extremely right-wing royalist, and another group is a kind of like liberal left-wing. So many two extreme groups. So then it's becoming two polars. So to be polarized people. So then polarization makes a kind of divided society, and it can be escalated into violence, and of course, like could be war or civil war. But of course, like on the other trend, even if we have reached certain extreme violence situation, you can see in several countries we have the stage of the ceasefire, reaching certain agreement, reaching normalization, and finally, hopefully that we can end many of the major conflicts by reaching the reconciliation. Okay, this is just like the escalation and this escalation. It doesn't mean that we have to escalate into the extreme extent as a curve. I mean, for example, if you experience that we are different, so then you can create a platform for the differences to be able to exchange, to be able to make the mutual understanding in order to reach the reconciliation by not escalating the situation into contradiction and polarization of violence. So then it doesn't mean that the escalation, you have to escalate into the extent, the extreme extent of it. You can just, if you experience the differences, you just can go directly into the reconciliation. That's fine, as long as you can create the platform to make mutual understanding, to see the share value of people in the society, this kind of stuff that can lead people into the reconciliation stage. If you read the chapter 2 in the book that I mentioned earlier, so then you see that there's a part of the conflict mapping and analysis. The conflict mapping analysis is the tools that make you see the relationship between several stakeholders. You can describe conflict that you have the background, context, dynamic, and how to manage the relationship of the people into the in that conflict situation. And you can draw the map, that use signs, symbols, boxes in order to link the relationship between each stakeholders, among several stakeholders, to see what kind of relationships and what kind of capability of each stakeholder can be used in reducing or resolving the conflict, or transforming the conflict, or maybe to be the connectors or a connector in several dimensions of the conflict. And it will make you to understand certain situation and positions of the conflict parties and certain set of relationship. You might be able to clarify the needs, wants, fears, and hatreds among the conflicted parties in order to understand the situation better, and also try to build a scenario that can be perceived, that we are proceeding, like out of the conflict. Finally, to analyze the situation in order to see the possible solutions, preferable outcome, and conflict resolution and transformation mechanisms. So then we can see things that beneficial and maybe useful for conflict transformation. At this point, you have a little bit more understanding on peace, conflict, and violence. in at any particular conflict situation, it's always possible that there are so many conditions. So of course, in one conflict, you can have information, you can have interest, you can have structure, you can have a relationship, you can have like a value, conditions of the conflict. So then, yes, of course, and of course, there could be several layers. So then there are the process or mechanisms that the concept that we use to deal with this. This is like reconstruction of the conflict. So it means that it's like the building collapse, the conflict situation is just like building collapse. So then you have to take out piece by piece. Of course, like that something very important is deep down there, but you cannot touch there without taking the pieces on the top out first, right? So then you can reach the point. So the conflict is the same, when the building collapsed. So then you take piece by piece the reconstruction of the conflict conditions.
And especially when we analyze a particular conflict, there are a lot of variables involved. Usually it's not only one causes, but many overlapping, and interacting causes in any conflict situations. And sometimes, the way that we address them is actually, depends on who we are. Who we are, what is our strength, what is our agenda. Sometimes, if we look at it from the perspective of communications, people will address communication issues. If people look at it from, behavioral perspective, then they will address behaviors first. For example, we look at the conflict triangle. You have the contradiction, the attitude, and the behavior. So in many cases, when you are faced with this particular situation, you are faced with a contradiction. Which one do you target first if you want to make your first move? Do you target the perception attitude, or do you target the behavior component? So in many situations, we focus on the action, what we can see, and then we delve deeper into why this is happening. It depends on again on our interest, on what we are trying to achieve, and all those things. And then we also need to understand that certain conflicts are more difficult to resolve than others. To many groups of actors involved in conflict situation, some of the issues are also negotiable, some are non-negotiable. Okay, which is what makes it even more difficult, because certain things like values, for example, people will say, I can compromise on land, I can compromise on other interests, power and other interests, but I cannot compromise on my values, identity, religion, language, and all those things. So when you have that kind of situation, then it makes it even more difficult, because the conflict is so personalized to the individual, to the group. Okay, so then it makes our job even more difficult in finding commonalities that can be used to move the resolution forward. So that's why values are always more difficult, and people use values not only as an issue, but sometimes to justify the action, which is always also very difficult. We see a lot of groups using religion, for example. I'm doing this for my religion, this is my jihad, I'm fighting for my religion. And how do you argue with that? And people don't mind doing violent actions, even killing themselves, because they feel this is important, and the reward they don't get in this world, but there is a reward waiting in the next world. So it always makes it very, very difficult when you have that kind of situation.
I give you an example then that's uh, regarding the issue of Rohingya. In the very beginning, or the very first wave after the conflict in Rakhine State, and of course, like they were the first wave of Rohingya refugee along the Thai border. Many of them heading to Malaysia. by that time, if you talk about the contradiction, so it means that Thai Navy has been pushing back very harshly into the Rohingya refugee and not applying any humanitarian conditions to the refugees at all. By that time, it raised the concern and the sympathy of the Thai public very much, which is the very attitude toward human being, right? And then behavior of the Navy is just like pushing them, just like very harshly. And then just a couple of days later, people started to raise the issues that these Rohingya are Muslim and they are traveling down south because they are in the unity of those movement, separatists in the deep south of Thailand. So then the attitude changed right away. That okay, these people are evil, so it's already good that you do that to the Rohingya refugees. So then you see, like the attitude plays a significant role in in the policies of the government, and of course, like the behavior, the same bad behavior can be done to those you feel sympathize with, but at the same time, but the same group of people, the same behavior would be accounted for good behavior right away when they consider these people are the enemies of them. So then you see, like the attitude plays role in the relationship with the contradiction and also the behavior of people.
Okay, in terms of that ABC triangle, ABC attitude, behavior, and contradiction, I think what we can take from our discussion is that, in any conflict situation, if we want to truly transform and resolve the conflict, we cannot focus on just one of the factor, of the variable. For us to resolve the contradiction, the conflict situation, sometimes people say contradiction, sometimes people say situation. We have to focus on the behavior. Yes, stop the war, stop the violence. But at the same time, never forget that we have to dig down deeper and look at the attitude and the perception of the actors in conflict. Especially, because there are certain attitude and behavior, attitude that can bring rise to a conflict situation. But the longer a particular group or an actor is involved in a conflict situation, the more that the attitude and the perception become negative. You will have stereotyping. You will have tunnel vision. Tunnel vision is like this. You just want to look at what you want to see. Even if people are saying, no, these people are actually good people. No, you have already made up your mind, and this is what you want to see, and this is how you want to see it. Okay, and these things takes time. Changing attitude, because of the emotion, changing perception, all these things takes time. So that's why we need to transform that culture of violence to become a culture of peace. And this is what we are doing. In peace education, this is what we are doing, because we want to change the mindset of the people, especially the actors involved in a conflict situation, that there are different ways of looking at things, and that instead of using violence all the time, we must transform the thinking. That's why peace education is very important. And then only when we have focus on both behavior and the attitude and perception, then only we can have an impact on the contradiction or the situation. So it has to be jointly done, together.